There is no weapon on earth more mythologized than the katana. People will argue about rifles, pistols, which army won which war. But when it comes to swords, katanas, for some reason, sit on a throne. It can cut through anything. It's folded 1,000 times. Indestructible, the ultimate warrior's blade. That's what we're told. But here's the real question. Why does a sword from feudal Japan live so deeply in American culture? Why is it in our garages, in our basements, in our movies, Tom Cruise? It sits next to our Springfield rifles and our 1911s. So let's talk about what the katana is and how it became American. A katana is a curved, single-edged blade, typically between 24 and 29 inches in blade length. It is worn edge up in the sash, and it is designed for two-handed use. It has several defining features. The first one that comes to my mind is differential hardening. What is differential hardening? Well, I'm glad you asked. You see, steel has a trade-off. Make it very hard, and it has a hard edge. But make it too hard and it becomes brittle. And you can't maximize everything all at one time in one place on a single piece of steel. So Japanese swordsmiths engineered a solution. Before quenching, the smith applies a layer of clay to the blade. Where you see these lines was actually painted in that clay. They put the thick clay along the spine and then no clay, or maybe a very, very light coat of clay along the edge. The blade is then heated to critical temperature. At that temperature, the steel's internal structure changes to something called austenite. The exposed edge cools rapidly, and the coated spine cools slowly. And that cooling speed determines the microstructure of the blade itself. The fast cooling turns the edge into what's called martensite, which is very hard and very rigid. And the slower cooling of the spine creates a softer structure, commonly known as pearlite or ferrite. And the result is a blade where the edge will cut and the spine will absorb shock. And that is engineering genius. And this leads us to the next, what I would call, defining feature of the katana. That visible line you see is what's known as the hamon or the hamon. I don't speak Japanese, but it's the physical boundary between the hard edge and the softer spine. You can physically see it. The shape of the hamon completely depends on how the clay was painted onto the metal, the temperature it goes through, how long, and ultimately the skill of the smith who did it. The shapes come in all different art forms and names like choji, which is a clove-like shape, gunōme, which is rolling waves like you can see here, Madare, which is like irregular patterns. And if you look closer at the hamon, you can see something called ni, which are the visible crystalline martensite particles inside the steel. You are physically looking at heat treatment of metal. And another thing that most people don't know is these blades are actually formed straight. They are smithed in a straight line, but with the softer steel on the bottom and the harder steel on the blade, when this is dipped into its cooling bath, when it's dipped into its cooling bath, because of that metallurgy, the blade takes on a curved shape in the water. Pretty cool. So the quench doesn't just harden the blade, it actually shapes it. In that moment, when the sword enters the water, determines whether the sword survives and takes on this shape, or just cracks, and it's a complete failure and waste of time for the bladesmith. Many blades are lost in the quench, but that risk is part of the craft. As you'll see later, the bladesmith who made this katana over 500 years ago was an absolute master bladesmith. Now, most Japanese swords are made from what's called tamahagane, and that tamahagane is smelted in a tatara furnace. Now, what is tamahagane and tatara? Well, I'm glad you asked. Tamahagane literally means jewel steel. It is the traditional Japanese steel produced from iron sand rather than iron ore. That right there is the key difference, because Europeans in the medieval times worked primarily with iron ore deposits when making their blades in the medieval period. Japan, lacking those ore deposits, relied on sand, magnetite-rich black sand collected from riverbeds. And iron sand behaves differently than ore. It requires a different smelting method, and that method is what the tatara furnace is. Charcoal is burned to extreme temperatures. Iron sand is then added in layers, then more charcoal, then more sand, constant air blast via bellows. And over a few days, tons and tons of iron sand and charcoal are consumed. At the end, the furnace is broken open, and inside is a steel bloom called a kera. Only a fraction of that bloom is high-quality sword steel, and only part of that is ideal high-carbon steel needed for sword blades. The rest ranges from wrought iron to cast iron, just depending. The bloom gets broken apart and sorted by eye. Japanese are really flexing now, because that requires immense skill. They're not testing these pieces of metal in a lab. They're looking at it and saying, yep, that's the right carbon content. I'll go into more detail into all this in another video, because I'm kind of starting to rant here. It's the tism's fault, the Ameritism. And since we're talking all that science, let's talk about fantasy. Now, is the sword steel folded? Yes, but the why matters. You see, because of the top mahogany steel being used, it had to be folded. It helped to remove impurities and balance the carbon content throughout the blade, because top mahogany is not uniform. If you forged the blade one time and left it alone, there'd be 95% carbon here, 3% carbon here, 50% carbon here, etc., etc. And the blade would not be uniform. It would be brittle in certain places, bendy in certain places, and that's not what you want for a sword blade. So the swordsmith would essentially bend the steel over, break it in half, fold it on itself, hammer it all down together again, and kind of coagulate all that carbon. Each fold would distribute carbon more evenly, expel slag, and just refine the grain structure overall. A typical katana would have been folded between 8 and 15 times, based on the eye of the swordsmith and where he sees what's going on with the metal. And yes, when you do that multiplication, in theory there are thousands of layers. But layers is not the goal, and I think that's what people miss here. The goal is homogenization throughout the entire blade, not just counting folds. Too many folds could actually burn out the carbon and weaken the blade. So there's a strong balance, and the Japanese swordsmiths figured it out. And they just continue to flex. The bottom line is the folding was necessary. It wasn't for magic, and it wasn't to look cool. There were also tons of different types of blade styles, with different compositions of soft, medium, and hard steels throughout. And we'll get into that at some point, but for this video, just realize that the metallurgy in a katana takes immense discipline and knowledge and skill, and the bladesmiths who made these deserve our respect. Here's something even bigger that we need to talk about. The katana was not a primary battlefield weapon. On the medieval battlefield, samurai primarily used spears, known as yari, polearms, called naginata, their longbows, which they called yumi, and in the later medieval times, matchlock arquebuses. The sword was secondary. It was a sidearm. When formations collapsed, when the distance closed, when everything got personal. If you're an American historian, this can kind of sound familiar. It's closer to the 1911 than the M1 Garand on a World War II battlefield. The katana's dominance in culture actually came later, during peace. Get ready for a historical rant. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu established the Edo shogunate. There's a great series covering this on Netflix, talking through the Sengoku period and how the three unifiers, being Oda Nobunaga, who began unification, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who completed unification, and then Tokugawa Ieyasu, who founded the shogunate. Go check it out, it's actually pretty good. With Tokugawa leadership, Japan entered over 2 centuries of relative peace. The samurai class transitioned from battlefield warriors to administrators, but they still wore swords. The daisho. The daisho is the wearer of the katana and the wakizashi. It became the legal symbol of the warrior class. So now, the sword's just not steel, it's identity, status, ritual, spiritual symbolism. And swordsmithing evolved into high art. Hamon patterns became deliberate and expressive. The grain structure, the hara, became aesthetic. Polishing became revelation. The blade transformed from tool to art. This blade here is from before all of that. Actually crafted in Japan during the Warring States period of the Koto era. And from what I found out online, it's from the Muromachi period, so 15th to 16th century. This would have been built and treated as a real sword, not a status symbol or piece of art because it came before all of that. But look how beautiful it is anyways. They weren't trying to make art, but they did it anyways. Video on this coming very soon. I'll put it away now so I don't keep talking about it. In 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate collapsed. Emperor Meiji took power in what we now call the Meiji Restoration. And this was more than a political shift. It was a complete rebuilding of Japan. The new government wanted a centralized nation, modern economy, a national conscript army, equal citizenship under law, and overall recognition as a modern world power. And the hereditary warrior elites that walked around armed in public disappeared. They didn't fit that vision, so they had to go. The samurai class wasn't abolished in a single stroke. It was dismantled piece by piece. In 1871, feudal domains were abolished. Samurai lost their regional lords. Does this mean everyone is Ronin now? Keanu Reeves might say yes. In 1873, Japan introduced universal conscription, so now farmers and merchants and whoever could serve in the military. The monopoly on violence, which had belonged to the samurai for centuries, was gone. And then came the final blow. In 1876, the Meiji government ordered the Haitōrei Edict, which, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it means the order that abolished swords. Former samurai could no longer wear the symbol of their class, unless they were an officer in the military or the police force. But for the hereditary warrior class, the blades that defined them were no longer allowed. And as Americans, we can imagine how devastating that would be. But nonetheless, some adapted. They became teachers, bureaucrats, businessmen, officers for the new Imperial Army. Others resisted. In 1877, former samurai, led by Saigo Takamori, launched what would become the final stand of the old order, the Satsuma Rebellion. Tom Cruise was there. They fought against a modern conscript army with rifles, artillery, centralized command. The rebellion failed, and with it, the samurai era ended. Here's the part that matters for this video. For hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, the sword was a weapon, a badge, a spiritual object, and symbol of legitimacy. And in less than a decade, it became illegal. When something that's central to a cultural identity disappears, it's impossible for it to just vanish. So it's gonna transform. The katana stopped being a necessity of Japanese life and instead started to become nostalgia. A symbol of true Japan, the dead warrior class. Thus, it became romanticized. By the time America encounters Japan in the early 20th century, the samurai, even in Japan, was more legend than a recent memory. And in my opinion, that Haitōrei Edict, the order to ban swords, it didn't ban the sword. It immortalized it. Because when something isn't used in daily life anymore, its meaning becomes whatever the imagination wants it to be. That's where this steel starts to become American story. Speaking of America, finally here, World War II would change the katana's destiny because American service members brought these home in the thousands. Some were traditionally made, maybe even relics from medieval feudal Japan, modified with different handles and guards for World War II battlefields. Some were cheaply made rush production ones called guntō. Guntō literally means military sword. These were Japanese military issued swords primarily from the late 19th century and through World War II. They're not medieval samurai swords, but they were modern military sidearms designed to evoke samurai heritage. It reinforced imperial identity and pretty much just served as an officer's weapon. Kind of like these American blades. There are different types of guntō, but the ones that come to mind for World War II would be the Type 94 Shin Guntō, the Type 98 Shin Guntō, and the Type 95 NCO sword. This is an 1840 NCO sword, so a bit later after America. The irony here is that Japan banned wearing a sword in 1876. The samurai class dissolved, but as we approached the 1930s, Japan was reviving samurai imagery through the guntō. The Japanese sword went from the outlaw to state propaganda. World War II era Japan used samurai symbolism to build national identity. This is modern nationalism wearing old clothes, and it proved to be very powerful. As you can imagine, to the American GI, it symbolized the enemy. But Americans also saw the honor, tradition, and Americans have always had respect for other warrior cultures. And so, as they moved into American homes, they also entered the American imagination. And cinema would make it immortal. Look at movies like Seven Samurai, Shōgun, The Last Samurai, 47 Ronin, Kill Bill. The katana in Hollywood screens became the ultimate dueling weapon, the blade of discipline, the weapon of purity. On the screen, we see it cutting through armor, cutting through rifle barrels. In reality, it is a highly optimized cutting weapon. However, it's not made to do that. It is not some supernatural weapon, although some people think they do hold a soul. But Hollywood turned performance into further legend than the katana already had. And what I think is extra important to highlight here is that Americans love archetypes. We love the cowboy in the West, the Marine on Guadalcanal with his 1911, the frontier rifleman making every shot count, the cavalry saber charging into battle against the Confederate Army. The katana represents all of this, and in its own way, it represents more. It represents a code if you look at Bushido or something of the like. And in a world where plastics and mass production exist, a blade forged by hand feels permanent, it feels rooted, it carries a memory. And so if there's anything that Americans connect to here, we connected to meaning. I mean, there are better battlefield weapons. There are stronger modern steels, which actually, some of these are very modern. But regardless of all that, there's no sword that has traveled further in the imagination than the katana. Not the crusader sword, not the officer's sword, not the cavalry saber, the katana. It was born in iron, sand, and charcoal, refined by fire, carried by warrior class that no longer exists, outlawed, revived by nationalism, carried into mechanized warfare, and then brought home across the Pacific as a war trophy, as steel taken from a fallen empire. And somewhere between American basements, Hollywood film reels, and collectors who began studying this blade rather than just displaying it, it stopped being their sword, and it became part of our story too. Not because it replaced the 1911 or the cavalry saber, but because it carries something on its own. It represents what we don't want to lose. The idea that steel can be forged by hand, intentionally, and that a weapon can become art. And that's why it lives here now, thousands of miles from the tatara furnace that it was created in. On Ameritism, art and history in barrel and blade.